We're picking up with Thomas Hobbes where we left off last week. Let me just repeat some of the things that I said last week about Hobbes. Perhaps most importantly is that the way Hobbes views the human condition is very closely connected with the new science that had been developed and the metaphysics around the new science. And as I mentioned last week, there were various contestations about how exactly the metaphysics operated, but there was a general agreement that what was all important was that the nature of things would be disclosed by looking at the universe as a totality governed by laws, and those laws ultimately all boil down to the study of cause and effect. So the model that Hobbes is working with is very much a cause and effect model, but it is a model in which the human condition is basically dissolved into the natural condition. So he's looking at us as appetitive forces. Second thing I should say about this, and this is important when we compare Hobbes to Locke, which will be an important part of the first half of this lecture, is that Hobbes's theory is not really normative at all. So what do I mean by that? It's not really normative. That is, insofar as the emphasis is upon the natural condition, that we are constituted as natural forces, we are ourselves a force of nature, that means that any kind of moral, ethical, larger, general principled claims about the way we should be are simply, from this point of view, epiphenomenon. They're epiphenomenon. Now, in the history of modern philosophy, at least from Descartes through to Kant, there's a real wrestling with this idea of what do we do given that we are constantly making moral claims, about the normative claims, about what people should do. And a concept like equality or freedom in its moral sense is usually always based around normative claims. But whether we're talking about Spinoza, who precedes Hobbes, or Hobbes, and then there are various others, but they are, I think, the two most important figures who deal with this problem, they are very much seeing that expression as simply something that in and of itself only makes sense insofar as it conforms to the natural condition. So what this means is we don't transport ourselves outside of nature in order to view it and then see ourselves as having dignity and other qualities that we should try and pursue in some way or impose upon reality in some way, that we're never able to have this fracture between the natural and the supranatural in this sense. Of course, one could argue that the actual study of nature in this manner is quite unique. That is, no other creature that we know of is able to think of nature as something that's constituted by a whole series of laws which they then try and study to put together their world. So that already suggests this kind of fracture within consciousness, and that's that kind of fracture which will be very important for some later philosophers. But when we get to Locke, and I won't really go into this, I'm just signalling it, we see that he comes up with a very normative-driven theory, but it's not clear how he's able to actually justify that in any genuinely philosophically coherent way. We will talk about Kant a little bit later, and I'll just signal the fact that Kant actually comes up with a philosophy that really tries to ground the moral condition, and he tries to ground that through a metaphysics. Whether it's successful or not is another thing, but the attempt is made, and he certainly is sure that he's been successful in making that attempt. But with Hobbes, what we're always looking at then is simply forces in nature. And what is so interesting about Hobbes is he's often considered a founder of liberalism, even though the kind of society he envisages is not particularly liberal. But it is considered to be a pioneer of liberalism for two main reasons. One is the vocabulary that he uses, especially the pivotal role that equality takes within that framework. And the second is that whereas the medieval thinkers of the political and the classical thinkers of political life, whereas they tended to try and find some fundamental cosmic good or a revealed good. And you can hear the word good as a very normative term, how you value something. Hobbes dispenses with that. And insofar as he dispenses with that, he is basically making the point, which becomes really important within liberalism, that people are free to choose and pursue the goods that they wish. So there is no what he calls summum bonum. There's no ultimate good that Hobbes is going to appeal to. There is an ultimate authority, and that will be a political authority. But it is not the task of this sovereign to lay down the higher ends or try and have the society pursue those higher ends of life. We'll see that the theory, and it's an intriguing theory, and as I said, it's very much at the core of liberalism, but then liberalism starts to develop a much more normative dynamic. But the core of the theory is one that sustains a society in which we can see the world as essentially atomized. It's atomized. And that the individuals within that can pursue their own tasks, provided it doesn't contradict, fall afoul of the decrees that the sovereign has laid down. And as we will see, there's one real rationale behind sovereign power in Hobbes. There's one real rationale. Let's get to that. First of all, equality. Why equality? And what does Hobbes mean by equality? Well, the simple answer to that, and it's a very simple answer, and it's a very interesting answer, is, as I said, it's not normative. It's simply because anybody may harm somebody. Anyone may do violence to someone. Now, even if you're very weak, because you have the capacity to communicate, you may form a group with other people, and that group can take their relative powerlessness and thereby enhance their power. Note this too, what I've just said, power. Underscore that. Hobbes' view of life, coming out of this naturalistic way of seeing life and the human condition, is one in which power is central. Power is central. So powers may be collected, and then they may be used for all manner of purposes, and one of those purposes may be it simply does us harm. First thing. Another component, I should have said maybe there's three things about Hobbes that are, rather than two, which I think fit the liberal tradition. And this third thing is that he works with a contractual view as operative as the basis of society. You recall me saying last week that in point of fact, European history, up until this point, especially through the evolution of the feudal mode of social production, was one in which contract was really essential for all sorts of duties and obligations. So what Hobbes has done, what Locke will do and what Rousseau will do, who are the three most important social contract theorists, what they will all do is basically take something that was actually a fact, but they transpose it into a mythic condition and thereby make of what was part of the modus operandi of social reproduction for a very long time and in very many parts of the world, they treat that as a principle. It becomes a principle. But what we notice with Hobbes, what we notice with Locke, and what we notice with Rousseau is that none of their rationales can be said to be defensible on a purely historical basis. It's not defensible on a purely historical basis. That, I think, is really interesting. And I think it's an important symptom of what is happening more broadly with the modern metaphysical transformation that the philosophers have been undertaking in trying to remake the world fit their image of what the world could be. Okay? So, a contract is, as I said, it's purely mythical, and yet we discern with each of the three thinkers that we'll look at in this respect. We're also going to look at Montesquieu today, but he's not relevant to this particular issue I'm raising. What they're all doing is certainly identifying an aspect of reality which may sound plausible. In the case of Hobbes, when he looks at the state of nature, he's looking at it as where there's, even though he puts it prior, he's putting the, what do you say, the cart before the horse, because he is seeing it as if it were social breakdown. As if it were, and this is actually something that both Locke and Rousseau are very attuned to, and one of the reasons they distance themselves from him. But what they come up with is no less mythical, but has a certain feature of existence that we can see that basically shores up the myth. So what Hobbes has done is he has seen what happened in the English Civil War. It's just chaos and violence. And he takes that, because there has been a social breakdown, as if what would happen that preceded the breakdown. That is, if we try to go back before society, he's saying it would look exactly like it does when there's a social breakdown. Now this is, it's not a compelling position, because as we know, the reason that there's a social breakdown in the first place is because of historical and social conditions that have led to conflict. But Hobbes takes the element of conflict as in and of itself as part of the natural condition. And then he says, in that natural condition, life, in a very famous formulation, and once you've heard it, I think you'll never forget it. It's one of those great phrases that just stick in your memory forever. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Nasty, brutish, and short. That is, it's short-lived, and it's a horrible place to live. No arts, no letters, no civilizations. All of these, arts, letters, civilizations, all of these have to be cultivated. And they have to be cultivated in an environment where we can't just do as we please, where we have to obey certain rules. Now, Hobbes does allow for one rule, I'll get to that a little later, in the state of nature, but in the main, and this follows from what I said, it's not a normative theory, it's his view of what the natural condition is. Force is right. Force is right. So whatever you do is right. So if you rape and pillage, there's nothing that suggests there's any more required for that undertaking than the capacity you have, the force at your disposal, in order to achieve what you will, to achieve the plunder, the raping, the pillaging, etc. But this is all existing in an environment where no one has been able to, and this is all important, enforce another kind of right. To enforce another kind of right where you can't do that. But in nature itself, you are what you do and you do what you can. See, that all lines up. So there's no sovereign. And if there's one right, and this is very like Spinoza as well, he argues that people naturally seek to survive. They naturally seek to survive. Now, there's even a bit of a problem there. And I'll tell you what that is, and it's something that's rarely picked up by political theorists. So there's a character who's quite an interesting guy, a guy named David Goldman, who would also write under the pseudonym Spengler. Now, he's not Oswald Spengler. Oswald Spengler was a very famous 20th century thinker who wrote about the decline and fall of civilizations. And he wrote a famous book called The Decline of the West. But David Goldman's work points out that very frequently there's death drives that are operative within peoples, within entire collectives. And he is interested in the fact, and this is a fact, that groups rise, they fall, and entire ways of life die. And he's actually interested in, to put it in Freudian terms, even though he's no Freudian, in the kind of death wish that sometimes overtakes groups. I think that is a really insightful and important thing. That's why I'm mentioning this. And I say, when you're thinking about human behavior, you should not simply rule out the death wish side of things. And you can see that even in the insignia of the Nazi Party and the Fascist Party, the way the skull and crossbones would appear, which is a death symbol in some of their insignia. And in some Islamist groups, for example, say we are prepared to die because we prefer death to life. Now that's a very sort of self-conscious modality of the death wish, and there's others that are much more, in a sense, less obvious in their manifestation. But this guy Spengler, stroke David Goldman, he even argues, and this is very interesting, there's something of a death wish at the moment in Western society, and he says we can see that by the low reproduction rates that are part and parcel of Western society. That is a really, and he says it's not only Western society, we can see it elsewhere too. He talks specifically a lot about Iran. But that is a very interesting insight. It's not the kind of insight that's going to fit Hobbes's picture, who's looking at everything in terms of survival. So, the right to survive is what we pursue, but he's also conceded that because power is right, there is an acquisitive drive within us. This too, I think, is something that is very, very important within the liberal picture of human beings. And when we get to John Locke, we basically see that the most essential right of all for Locke is a right to acquire property. And one way that we can look at liberal society, it's not the only way, but it is an aspect of it, is that we accept the acquisitive capacity of individuals that it should have an outlet. So the right to acquire, the acquisitive nature of our being. And of course, that notion or principle is really important to a society which takes economic production as a primary goal of human motivation. Okay? So it takes the acquisitive characteristic, and indeed, it's so important because without that characteristic, there will not be economic growth. In some ways, I think, now I'm going to leap right ahead. I'm going to leap right ahead to more contemporary kind of political narratives. Let's take feminism. It's a very good example of that. The feminism of the 1960s was very much predicated upon the belief that power had been patriarchal, and that had therefore led to all sorts of inequalities in the distribution of wealth, and inequalities which could only be overcome if rights were granted which would enable women to get beyond the glass ceilings that were preventing their economic and other aspects of their being, the development. But that is very much in keeping with this idea of the acquisitive individual. Even if you're referring to a block or a group who's deficient in their what is permitted for them to be able to do, you could see that unless you had this previous idea, the next one would not really follow. And of course, you didn't have women seeking acquisitive power in this way up until very modern times. Okay, so that's something very social, but the social is also spawned through a set of ideational developments in which we come to see ourselves and our position in the world a certain way. Very historical. So Hobbes is saying we are acquisitive beings, and in the state of nature, our acquisitive pursuits, which are also in part stemming from the very need to survive, but not only then to survive, but to get more, to acquire more, but these acquisitive pursuits are such that we're constantly in conflict with each other. And then Hobbes comes up with the idea, and this is one of those examples where you take something that has been a traditional bottle, if you like, a traditional name, and you put a whole new meaning into it. Because Hobbes says, well, in this state of nature, it's not the case that people are always running around killing each other. He says, now why not? He's thinking, why don't they do that? And he says, because they recognize that what they can do to someone, someone may be able to do to them. And he says, so therefore there's this natural law that's operative in the state of nature, and that's the golden rule. Now usually we think of the golden rule as a kind of biblical or rationalist formulation in which we don't do harm to others because we would not like to experience what someone else would experience if we did them harm. So that's the basis of the golden rule. Now, Hobbes calls this a natural law. The phrase or the term natural law has a long pedigree, and you may remember we find it in Aristotle, who's very explicit about what natural justice stroke law is, and we find it in Cicero. And I think I may have mentioned this, but Cicero famously put in his Republic, there is one law, whether it be in Athens, Jerusalem, or Rome, which is always the law. So that's a kind of cosmic principle, and that is where we should take our orientation from. And human laws which contradict that natural law, they are in violation of our very nature. Okay, you've got that. Hobbes has actually turned that on its head. Hobbes is showing that, from his position, that way of thinking is nonsense. The natural law is the golden rule, so far so good, but it's simply based upon mutual fear and suspicion. It's fear that guides that law. It's just fear, and that's a natural property. It's got nothing to do with reason as such. All we're doing with our reason is giving voice to that set of sentiments which are part of our inner nature. It shouldn't be used to try and curb our nature, because it doesn't really curb our nature, it's just another aspect of our nature. However, we will see that where the sovereign's power does not rule out certain things, that is, in those spheres of life where it doesn't have actual entrance, where there's no specific law that's been laid down, Hobbes says it's very natural that we would fall upon this natural law. It's very natural that we'd fall upon this natural law, which is the golden rule. But there is a transition, and this will be the same in Locke and in Rousseau as well as Hobbes, that you have to move from this basic state of nature to a civil condition, a political condition. And the political condition, according to Hobbes, comes about because within this state of nature, the capacity to do things, remember no arts, no letters, no civilization, the capacity to actually build things and secure them is thwarted by our own nature. So Hobbes then says, what happens in the state of nature is out of fear, people make a decision to devolve their natural right. They give it up. They give it up. And they give it to a sovereign power who is a greater power. You remember that picture that we had from the front piece of the Leviathan? Hobbes' great work, which discusses all of this. The Leviathan being the great biblical sea monster mentioned in the book of Job. That is a power that is built upon the power of the wills of all those in the state of nature that have devolved their own relatively insignificant power to a greater power. So it's a transition in which there is greater authority. And that transition is such, and this again is something that is very illiberal in Hobbes. Once that has taken place, there is only one right that remains with the bodies of those that have handed over the power. And that right is the right to life. It's the right to one's own life. How could you, says Hobbes, given that survival is part of the very basic of the human fabric, how can you hand over that right? And you can't expect someone to hand over that right to their own life. So, what has happened in this picture, and it is a picture, a mythic picture, a story, that's all we mean by myth. It's a story in which people are able to develop capacities by surrendering those capacities which can do harm to each other. This is done once and once only. It is the foundation of a society. It's a foundational act. As we say, it never happened. It's mythic. But Hobbes' reasoning suggests something like this must have occurred. And again, I will say historically, if we look at feudalism, we look at the way in which that society, or we note the way in which that society was essentially a protection racket. You protect me, I will give you this. I'll grow food for you if you protect me. You know, that's the most simple formulation of that, or within a town, etc. But it's not recurrent. So what then constrains the political will of the sovereign? Now liberalism has an answer to that, and Locke has an answer to that, and that is, well, you must go back periodically to the people to get direction about what you do with your sovereignty. So the sovereign then becomes a representative. This sovereign is not really a representative of anything other than keeping order. So, the sovereign is, and it's interesting how often this formulation finds itself repeated in the typical narrative about the state. And that is, the sovereign power has a monopolization of violence. The sovereign power is what basically can raise the army or the police force or the equivalent thereof. There wasn't a police force at this time, but basically has the authority to legitimately be violent. and that's a very famous formulation of Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, who provides this formulation of the state as a bounded territory in which there is a monopoly of violence held by the state. So this monopoly of violence exists because it is a good thing. It's a good thing. Of course, the question is going to come up, but why or what? What do we do if the sovereign is just a raving lunatic who uses their power to simply gain economic advantage and all sorts of other advantages at our expense? And Hobbes' basic argument against that, it's not even an argument, it's basically he advises the sovereign. It's more advice than an argument. But his advice to the sovereign is, look, if you do that, you'll just repeat the state of nature. So there's no point in doing that. Your job is to lay down the laws, let people do what they wish, and then get out of the way and let them do that, as long as they're not violating the order. So he's slipping in a kind of normative dimension into authority, but as I said, it's purely advisory rather than sheerly principle. I've said all this, so I won't carry on with that. I've said this. I've said this. Oh, I'll just mention one thing on this slide, because I basically said this. This is a view of freedom that, in a very famous essay called Two Views of Liberty by Isaiah Berlin is in the city, is called a negative view of freedom. That is, it is not the job of the sovereign, as I said, to cultivate people in such a way in accordance with more general communal principles which enable them to have a more positive kind of freedom. What do I mean by positive freedom? Freedom in that sense would mean capacity. That's something that they actually have to figure out. In fact, this is part of the problem with this is no society can reproduce itself without cultivating certain qualities. So it's this liberal picture that Hobbes has is a very minimalist view of what sovereign authority does. And it's no accident that as liberal states develop, that education, for example, becomes a very important thing for the state to be involved in. And there's all sorts of practical reasons why that is the case. Hobbes doesn't really think that through. But the sovereign has the power to be just, should all judges the thing necessary to be thereby to prevent discord and civil war. That is what the whole purpose of political authority is. Why we need a Leviathan. What is the Leviathan? So, now let's turn to John Locke. Now, one of the big differences between Hobbes and Locke is the time in which they're writing. They're both coming out of Great Britain. So they're both socialized within a certain historical context in which, in the first case, in Hobbes's case, the Civil War is raging. You recall the English Civil War, one of the important features for its breakout is simply the Crown needs revenue and is therefore taking property which has not been handed over to them willingly. That's the simplest formulation I can give for that. Locke, on the other hand, he is writing after that civil war has played itself out, and when he writes the two treatises of government, which is his most important theoretical contribution to political philosophy, when he's writing that, a Bill of Rights has been established, And, indeed, Britain has just become a constitutional monarchy. So there already is in place the essential elements for representative government. That's very important. But representative government at this stage basically means the government is representing those people that have sufficient resources to be able to contribute revenue to the Crown. So those people that can be taxed. And of course, everyone is paying tax in various different ways, but they actually meant their landed property. Now, let's go back a bit and say that, like Hobbes, Locke was very caught up in the ideas about natural philosophy, the study of nature, that had really taken hold of the philosophical imagination. There are very few people that we still remember who operate outside that way of emphasizing things. But there are some. There are some, and some of them are very important. One is a character called Vico, V-I-C-O, who's one of my favorite philosophers, but we won't go into that. He had written a book called Essay on Human Understanding, in which he argued that all knowledge is based upon experience. All knowledge is based upon experience. That actually is kind of right, but when you see how he goes about this, you see that it's a deeply flawed philosophical model, because his way of understanding experience is actually a scientific view of what experience is. The only reason I mention that is because this will become an important issue in subsequent developments in philosophy, where they realize that, well, everyday life is still experiential, even though everyday life is nothing like the kind of stuff that can be broken down in terms of scientific inquiry, where you're dealing with forces in motion, atoms and etc., mechanisms. The other thing about Locke worth mentioning, he had written a letter on toleration. So this of course is going to be something very important to the liberal tradition. Whereas Hobbes had emphasized the importance of acquisitive pursuits and setting one's own goals in life, Hobbes had also really recognized the dangers of religious polarization. And that, of course, had been a driving force behind the English Civil War. You remember me saying that Henry VIII had nationalized the church, but the ecclesiology that he was operative with was not the reformist one. And the English Civil War, a major driver of that Civil War, had to do with those coming out of the reformist tradition, particularly the Calvinist tradition as it moved through Scotland. Interestingly, in the letter of toleration, one group who Locke refuses to give any tolerance for are the Catholics. Can anyone tell me why? Why not the Catholics? There had been running battles going on ever since Henry between not only the Reformers and the Anglicans, but also the Catholics. And the Jesuits had been smuggled in and teaching this stuff, and anyone found doing this could be executed. The answer is very simple. Who do the Catholics give their ultimate loyalties to? The Crown or Rome? Rome. So this is the problem. It would take almost a century before the Catholics, maybe even a little longer, but around that kind of time, before Catholics could be seen as deserving of tolerance. But you had to change. This is very interesting, because what Locke is doing, he doesn't really express it thus, but this is certainly how he's thinking. There's a certain culture that is operative within the Catholic Church that's not operative in the Protestant Church. And we need, in order to have stable social reproduction, we need to cultivate citizens a certain way so that they can be tolerant of each other, and we don't trust that this group is going to be tolerant enough. And so they are still, in a sense, intolerables. Now, Locke also views the Civil War in a very different way to Hobbes. Let me say straight out, and this is very clear from when you read Hobbes's writing called Behemoth, which is also another great work of his, where he talks about the Long Parliament. Hobbes's view of sovereignty is consistent with a monarchical form of government. And in that sense, it's not really liberal. But when you read Behemoth, it's very clear that in the main, Hobbes doesn't really care that much about how you get there, as long as you get there, as long as you have that sovereign. Because the worst thing you can have is and there's two other worst conditions. One is a completely divided sovereignty, and remember our discussion about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and that divided sovereignty that was happening in Europe because of the difference between the papal claims and the imperial claims. Hobbes, I think I mentioned this, but I'll repeat it. Hobbes had said that the entire English Civil War is really predicated upon that initial fracturing between the imperial and papal claims. That is a fascinating insight, because he had recognized how violent Europe had been for so long. Again, we keep coming. Hobbes himself actually knew a lot about history. And there's no doubt about that. And he was fascinated by history, but the theory, as we said, it's super historical. Now, so that's where Hobbes's emphasis is. Divided sovereignty is dangerous, or no sovereignty is dangerous. Social breakdown is dangerous. So as long as you have a sovereign, all well and good. Hobbes comes at it really differently. Locke comes at it really differently. And there's one essential idea that's operative. And remember me saying Hobbes sees an aspect of reality, and that is the basis of his theory. Well, Locke sees another aspect of reality, and that's the basis of his. And his thing is this. And it also shapes how he sees the Civil War itself. And what he sees is, look, if people are left to their own devices, we can see that they are capable of commercial exchange. They are capable of cooperation. And indeed, his thinking is, the Civil War wouldn't have happened had the Crown acted legally. Had the Crown not just set itself up as having prerogative power, but had it seen its role as a much more representative position, or as a much more representative kind of office, and had it understood, and here's the all-important thing, that the wealth upon which it needs to draw is not its creation, but it's the creation of those that go out, work, employ, accumulate land, accumulate property, therefore pay the wages for other people to help in this accumulative process, this economic process. In this way, Locke is far more focused upon political economy. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that Locke's work on writing in the second treatise of government is based around a certain economic understanding of human behaviour. And at the centrepiece of that is what in economic theory, and we'll find this again when we look at Karl Marx, is called the labour theory of value. And the labour theory of value, I'm not giving it its Marxist formulation, I will do that later, I'll give its more elemental formulation in Locke, is that you have a right to something because you've exercised labour upon it. So, where in nature, in its abundant state, if you pick up an apple, that apple is rightfully yours if you're the first to pick it up, because you've expended that little bit of energy. Likewise, if you plough a field and you grow stuff on it, you have a right to that stuff because you've done the labour. It's a very plausible kind of theory. It starts with the view of nature as much more beneficent and benign than Hobbes' view of nature. It starts there. And as I said, it's already giving an emphasis upon cooperation, which is the basis of any kind of economic activity. And we all know, to give Locke his due, we all know that there's basically two ways to get wealth. Historically, we know this. One is you force someone to produce it for you, and you take it at gunpoint or knife point or spear point or bow and arrow point, or whichever way you go about it. So plunder. And plunder has been a very common source of wealth accumulation with empires and with monarchies, etc. The other one is you work, you cooperate, you trade. Work, cooperation, trade. And for Locke, this work, cooperation and trade are very part of our nature. And again, that's not completely implausible, but one might argue that you need certain things in place for that to be sustainable. So Locke is interested in identifying within this so-called state of nature, he's gone back to the state of nature, how this might take place. So, in the state of nature, which is not now to be confused with a state of war, because he sees a state of war breaking out when there's something has disturbed the natural condition, and the more beneficent powers that are indicative of or that develop in the state of nature and then develop through civil society. So this is another important feature of Locke. He sees human development very much in a stage theory kind of way. That's a term that would become quite popular in the 19th century. So there's stages of social complexity bound up with the development of the division of labour. And as that develops, the societies, its laws, the way authority is operative within that society has to be such that it nurtures that. So here we see the transition from nature to society is a much more peaceable development. It's not because people are all killing each other. Far from it. People in the state of nature, according to Locke, they're naturally reasonable. And there's a natural liberty which is free from any superiors. This freedom is at the very basis of nature. And their propensity to cooperate, which is what enables further economic development, and so note the acquisitive component of this, it enables development of greater acquisitive capacity. All of this is something that emerges because reason and nature are congruent. They're congruent with each other. They help, they reinforce each other. However, it is the case that as we create stuff and acquire stuff, first of all, there's going to be conflict over who actually owns what. There will still be conflict. There will be those that don't want to labour, that will just want to take. But there will very often be simply a need to mediate between different points of view about who has propriety over what. The mediated one. That's very different from Hobbes. You could say Hobbes mediates, but he mediates because of the need to apply force to force. In Locke's case, what's all important is that in the desire to acquire and develop property, we can't do it without mediation. And we're not a good judge in our own case. Our own interest will shape what we do. You see how this is normative in the very way it's set up too. We need someone that's able to overlook things and see what is right and what is wrong. It's a very judicial way of seeing things. Again, although Hobbes talks about justice and judgment and judges, etc., it's power. But here, it's principle that is operative. So the end of government is the preservation of liberty, and liberty's aim is the enhancement, development, and protection of property. Locke says at one point, look, we know that even when a soldier who's prepared to lay down their life is shot in a war or killed in a war, we know that it is wrong, that it is against the code of conflict, that we can just go and take stuff from them. Their property is sacred. It's inviolable. And it's interesting, it's even more inviolable in some ways than life itself. And that, I think, too, is part... And indeed, if you think about the way in which, over time, property is transferred across generations, you can see that Locke is actually, again, focused on some feature of reality which is put into this grand theory. Now, another important point about Locke, and I think when we speak about Marx, I'm raising it here now because we will speak about the way Marx views property. Marx doesn't really consider property in this way. And because he doesn't see property in this way, I think he's missing out on something that is very fundamental to the evolution and development of liberal societies. And this is the importance of one's body and talents as property. One's body and talents are one's property. And why does that matter? Well, that suggests that economic exchange is not only built around the time spent in labour, but about the qualities that you bring into any activity, the quality that you bring to an activity. And this, I think, is a very important concept in Locke, and even when it's not acknowledged or recognised or even known that Locke had developed this idea, it's something that shouldn't be overlooked if you want to understand the way in which economies function and the way in which, that is, a free market economy functions. So it's not just about what you've acquired in terms of stuff, it's also what you acquire and develop in terms of talent. Now, there's another central feature of liberalism that's also emphasized in Locke, and that's the right to voluntary association. Now, one of the things about liberal societies is that liberal societies tend to push against, and people that come from much more traditional societies, and this might be Muslim societies, or it might be China, or various other locations. One of the things about liberal societies is this element of the voluntary, of the human will, and association suggests that communal association that is involuntary is something that thwarts your freedom. It thwarts your freedom. And if property and freedom are going to be the primary drivers of what we value, the norms that we direct ourselves by, then voluntary association enables us to move between associations. You can see that if you take this to its logical progression, that something like divorce, for example, is going to be intrinsic to this understanding of reality. So the family, the more traditional, one's religion, one's faith, one can move out of that. One can One may be in a family, but I don't want anything to do with them. I'm not going to be beholden to them. You know, the much more traditional and archaic modalities of social solidarity, they're being fractured through this emphasis upon the right of voluntary association. And I think it's true to say that one of the essential ingredients of all societies which have been influenced by liberal principles are ones in which traditional forms of solidarity are deeply threatened because of the elevation of the individual will, the individual capacities, and will itself is another capacity, the individual will being able to align itself with other wills to engage in forms of solidarity and cooperation. Locke focuses primarily upon this in terms of economic activity, but it should not be taken as if he's only referring to economic activity. It's not exclusively economic. And it's very much bound up with such ideas as the right to be able to organize oneself politically, to make criticism, and to speak openly about the direction of the society as a whole. Even though this is occurring in the context of the primary rationale behind the state is its defense of society and the scale of the acquisition of property. So, cooperation, a kind of natural rationality, voluntary association, is also bound up with what Locke sees as a very natural development, and that natural development is the expansion of capacities that are available to the society as a whole has because of the new kinds of associations that are formed. So these new kinds of association lead to greater division of labour and greater economic application and money. We need money, and we'll need banks, and we'll need cities, and we'll need all these other things that are necessary, and therefore we'll need laws which protect our property. And they too, in Locke's way of thinking, are all the development and evolution of our contractual capacity through our acquisitive character. For this to then to be done well, we have to ensure that the sovereign does not reach a condition which was the natural condition under the monarchical systems, where the sovereign is someone outside the law. And that when you're outside the law, you have what's called prerogative power. I can do it because I am the ruler, and so the laws don't apply to me. This is something that Locke sees as part of the problem that caused the Civil War, and the only way to prevent this is that the state has to be seen as a representative body, and not just seen, it has to be a representative body. This requires periodic elections, equal application of the law, hence it's a rule of law. And the idea of the rule of law has a long pedigree. It precedes liberalism. But liberalism certainly takes this idea of the rule of law and places it in an arena in which individual characteristics, voluntary association, contractual interaction, etc., is part and parcel of social reproduction. The legislature cannot transfer its lawmaking power. That is, the people can't hand over the power once and for all, because that would mean enslaving them. And indeed, Locke even has a right of rebellion if the government ignores his will. And the key thing about the state, as we've mentioned numerous times now, is that it has a role in extracting resources and transferring them. This group, that group, favouring this, requiring things from that. Every man has property in his own person. That was a point I made earlier. Okay, let's have a little break. And then we'll come back and start talking about France. Okay, what I want to do now is I'm primarily going to talk about Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both very important thinkers. They both are writing prior to the French Revolution, but both of them, especially Rousseau, are very important figures in what will become leading narratives within the French Revolution, especially by the elite. And I just want to speak generally about France earlier, just to give you some idea of why it became the kind of system it was, why it was breaking down, and then looking at Montesquieu and Rousseau and how they are important figures in leading up to the revolution. Though in the case of Montesquieu, he's much more, that's somewhat too simplistic. First of all, I'll just go over here to the right. If we look at France at the time of revolution, so this is 1789, you've got 27 million people, and you've got a very skewed hierarchical relationship. The church owns 10% of the land. They're the first estate. They constitute about 130,000 people. The church itself, as those of you in my other class recall, is very divided between the upper clergy and the lower clergy. There's a second estate, the nobility, which owns about 25 to 30% of the land. That's only 350,000 people. And they have political rights and privileges which transfer to their ability to avoid taxation, to put it bluntly, largely. And then you've got the third estate, which is predominantly, but not only, the peasantry. There's also an urban population, which we call the bourgeoisie, not to be confused with the way that Marx uses that term. It simply means the city dwellers, often artisans, but it can also mean the lawyers, the merchants, the bankers, manufacturing, finance professionals, craftsmen, journalists, scientists, etc. So what had happened at the time of the French Revolution is that the state had become incredibly centralized. Political authority was very centralized. The state itself was really dysfunctional because it wasn't that centralized because of the way taxation was collected. And in part, one of the things that I say periodically is that the solution to one problem always creates the genesis of a major problem. And in the 17th century, there are a number of civil wars that broke out. They were called the Wars of the Fronde. And they were primarily being led by the nobles. And you recall within the feudal system, the crown needs the nobles to gather armed forces, to put it bluntly. And then they have a territory in which they preside over, but they still have to provide revenue for the crown. And there was a lot of conflict around that, and the way that the crown then responded, and this is by no means unique to France. We can see various examples elsewhere. It happened in Russia in a different way. It happened earlier in the United Kingdom, is that the crown had basically tried to take away political power from the nobles. And the way that it did that is it established the court at Versailles, and within that court, the nobles were basically just courtiers. They were living a very privileged life, but their political function had diminished. Of course, they still extracted revenue from those around them, but the crown had found all sorts of other agents to extract revenue from those territories. But this certainly helped cement the rise of monarchical absolutism in France. And I think without that monarchical absolutism, supported, and the great theorist of this is a guy called Jean Bodin, B-O-D-I-N, was to appeal to the divine right of kings. You might recall me saying in the Treatise of Government of John Locke, but the first treatise was also an argument against the divine right of kings. So this divine right of kings was occurring wherever you had greater state centralization or political centralization. There had also been huge religious problems and religious wars that had plagued France through much of the 16th and into the 17th century, but it really dominated the 16th century. And the St. Bartholomew massacre had also led to the expulsion of the Huguenots, which were the Protestants in that area. So the Reformation, this is the only reason I'm really bringing this up, is the Reformation had a big impact upon what was going on in France, even though France reacted by preserving its Catholic traditions and persecuting the Protestants or expelling them. Why is that important? Well, when we get to people like Montesquieu and Rousseau, we're seeing that the more secularist ideas are already starting to really take hold amongst the intelligentsia. So they're not thinking like the reformers. They're not thinking like Calvin. They're not thinking like Luther. But Calvinism, in many ways, has helped facilitate a condition where it's not so much the victory of the reformed consciousness that will be the ultimate of what you have. It's actually the diminution of Catholic authority and a fracturing within Christendom, which opens a way then for what will be the case in the French Revolution of a general anti-clerical sensibility, a more general anti-clerical sensibility. It had also, and the reform had also influenced France in terms even in entering into the Catholic religious traditions, particularly the Jansenists, who were in many ways like Protestants in what they thought, but they were doing it under the auspices or aegis of the Catholic Church. But it was a kind of erosion again of more traditional Catholic sensibilities within the Catholic framework. The Crown had allied itself originally with the Jesuits. Where are the Jesuits from? Basically, they emerge in Spain, of course, but they're loyal to Rome. And the Jesuits became a very hated group within France, and they would eventually be expelled from France. I mentioned the church was divided between its local priests and upper clergy, and as the revolution occurred, a number of those local priests would end up just going with the authorities. Not all by any means, but going with the authorities and actually fueling the anti-clerical sentiment. Some of them would just give up the priesthood altogether. Now, in keeping with the concentration of monarchical power, it's really noteworthy that the Estates General, who had essentially an advisory role around legislative matters, but they were required ultimately to give a seal of approval to what the Crown did, but they didn't initiate anything, had not met since 1614. There was also a real hostility going on within France about the way that taxation had been shared. And very little was being paid by the first two estates. So to sum this up, and this is something when we look at Montesquieu, he focuses upon, and that is there was a mismatch between political power and social power. There's this great mismatch between political power and social power. And as I've mentioned in the Revolutions course, it's almost an axiom that you can deploy when thinking about politics is when a group with privileges no longer performs the functions that were the condition of the privileges, that is, the privileges initially are always bound up with obligations. But when those obligations have contracted so severely that they're almost non-existent or perceived to be non-existent, and because they are so lacking, then you've got a real problem. And you've got a problem because you've got other groups with social power who are essential for the functioning of the society, unable to articulate their needs and their interests. So that is a recipe for rebellion. So there was a concentration of political power in non-productive classes, which created enemies. Now, the peasantry as such, although it would be really important in the French Revolution, they basically wanted, which is always the case wherever you find this kind of occurrence, they basically wanted very specific things. They weren't really interested in ideas about equality and freedom. Those are the kind of ideas that the philosophers, the enlightened thinkers, and the professionals would draw upon. But their lot was basically dependent upon good seasons, and in the town, that's where you had a literate body of potentially political interests. Another important point just to mention in passing is that one of the reasons that the French Revolution broke out was because the crown was broke. And France had been involved in the 7 Years' War, actually lasted 9 years, which pretty well came close to bankrupting it. And then it had also supported the American revolutionaries. That is so fascinating. Again, in the other course, we spent a lot of time on this. That the Crown had actually supported the independence of a group who would then be seen as showing the way forward for these other groups, discontented groups in France. So in a sense, you could say the Crown had been digging its own grave. And then there were a whole body of ideas that were being developed by the enlightened philosophers. I've mentioned this again in this other class, but I'll say it here. If you take those three estates, the first of them, the clergy, would often be referred to as the class that prayed. The class that prayed. The philosophers, that's their real, I think, that's their real enemy. That is, they are the class that wants to provide orientation. And prayer and religion, which in our more secular age we often don't understand as fundamental formative character, that character is predicated upon the fact that it provides orientation towards the powers of life which we don't really understand. So we attempt to supplicate them. Now, the enlightened philosophers are basically saying we can understand the various powers of life. And if you read our books and listen to us and allow us to be your educators, we will give you the orientation that those priests who are increasingly seen by that class as scoundrels, sycophants, useless bunch, come to us, we will educate you because we have reason and light on our side and we can understand how to do things, and we will guide you into being able to make a world in which your participation is such that you can make it in a way that suits your needs. So the Enlightenment, and we recall that Descartes is rightly often seen as one of the pioneering figures, perhaps the most important pioneer of the Enlightenment. And you will recall that Descartes had appealed to reason being something that we all have. It's a kind of natural light. It was a pan-European movement. And you will recall when I mentioned the other great early Enlightenment metaphysicians and philosophers, you had Germans, you had Italians, you had British, you had French, so it wasn't localized. A new kind of narrative, a new kind of discourse had been established which certain intellectual elite were privy to and could bond around, and the differences were insignificant compared to what they have in common. It's a little bit like Locke and Hobbes. What they have in common in the long run is far more important than what they don't have in common. And that's the same with Aristotle and Plato. Remember them, you know. Aristotle is critical of Plato, but Aristotle would not have been Aristotle without Plato. They emphasized reason over tradition. So tradition, in fact, it's interesting in the 19th century when you've got another group of people who come out of the Enlightenment, react against the Enlightenment, but never would have existed without the Enlightenment. They're a group we call the Romantic thinkers. They were a group that did emphasize history and tradition and its importance. The Enlightenment, though, generally saw tradition as something that frustrated reason. That is, the powers that had traditional authority behind them no longer had any rationale that was remotely reasonable behind them. And if we take our reason into the world around us, and we start tapping away and looking at these traditions, we can come up with something much better, much more rational, better in terms of it being rational, than what they did. Now, in point of fact, actually, reason of itself is actually no more easy to grasp than a God. No more something that's simply there that you can find, that you can all agree upon. And you know how you know this is because philosophers never agree with themselves. And it's in the nature of life that reason isn't in and of itself. Even though a lot of these philosophers were speaking of reason as if it was somehow something in and of itself, as if it was like a substance. And that substance is something that we could attach ourselves to, that we could be guided by, that displaced God or any other higher mysterious force, which was just the product of superstition, fear, manipulation. And this is basically how many, not all, but many of the most important Enlightenment thinkers, especially as it develops in the 18th century, how they saw religious authority. Superstition. They tended to have faith in progress, so they saw the world as something moving from darkness to light. They required rational legitimacy of authority. Why should we be obligated to something that makes no sense? Why should we be obligated to that? And anything that requires divine authority, and especially government. You could see why also someone like John Locke is going to be an important Enlightenment thinker as well, and is very important to a number of French philosophers. So it was a philosophically driven movement. I'll mention very briefly three figures, and I'll focus a little bit more on Voltaire before I talk about Montesquieu and Rousseau. In the middle, around the middle of the 18th century, there was a massive undertaking, and that was the writing of an encyclopedia. And the idea was that all worldly knowledge could be pooled, and it would be in these many volumes. And Denis Diderot was a leading figure in that. Diderot is a very interesting thinker. He was attracted by the exotic, and his book Rameau's Nephew is one which the German philosopher writing in the earlier part of the 19th century saw as a definitive text of that time, because he saw it as advocating a position in which reason and cynicism, a certain kind of nihilism, a cynical approach, would be definitive. And indeed, Diderot, although he does believe in natural law in his way, he's an interesting character because his view of human behaviour and moral authority is very much based around energy and sentiment. Energy and sentiment. So that I think is very much in keeping with this naturalist tradition. One character I haven't put on the board, but I will mention just briefly in passing, is the Marquis de Sade. Sade is really the bad boy of the Enlightenment, but he certainly presents his thinking as enlightened. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the Sade. I'm sure you've heard the word sadism, but Sade's books are books in which there are great orgiastic, murderous, carnivalesque engagements, which are all presented as if they have a rational basis and that they are based in nature. And Sade has argued that the desire for pleasure is bound up with our capacity for cruelty, and that our capacity for cruelty and the desire for pleasure is just natural, and that the world, in a sense, is an evil defiance, an act of evil defiance. I'm really simplifying Sade, but that's not long. The next character is a character called D'Alembert, who is a great mathematician, an important figure in the Enlightenment canon, and then Voltaire. And I'll just briefly pause upon Voltaire. Voltaire is not a great philosopher as such, but he did have enormous popularity. And his popularity really came out of his standing up for liberty. You might have heard the phrase, I do not agree with what you say, but I defend them to the death your right to say it. That's very much Voltaire. It was Voltaire that also said, away with the infamy, when he was talking about the clergy. It was Voltaire that, like Diderot, Voltaire was very interested in other cultures, and he was fascinated by the fact that people experience the world in very different ways, and much of which still for Voltaire was very superstitious, and he was looking for ways in which to expose, or he was exposing all the superstitious behaviour around him. And then we'll come to Montesquieu and Rousseau, I'll talk about in more depth. The French Revolution was at its head, if not in its actual practice, that is, the eruptions weren't philosophical, but the meaning given to the revolution and the institutional direction was very much governed by certain philosophical ideas, and they were very anti-Christian. And it would lay the basis for a much more secular kind of society in which religion then would be simply compartmentalized purely into the private sphere. So let's look at Baron de Montesquieu. The first thing I want to say about Montesquieu is, let's compare him to Locke. Locke's view of society and of government comes back to what we could say a methodological move. And that move we can call constructivist. It's actually a term that another liberal political economist called Friedrich von Hayek, writing in the 20th century, he came up with this term constructivist. And I think it's very, very apposite. It's a good term. It really captures it. Because basically what Locke is doing is he's looking at a society as if the principles that underlying it suffice to give you the understanding of its nature. So he constructs a kind of political and social framework on the basis of the abstractions he's made, which we went into previously, property, cooperation, rationality, etc. And the way forward then is to try and construct the right society and the right principles to govern the society. This is very different from Montesquieu. And as different as Rousseau is from Locke, Rousseau is also very much a constructivist. That is, the way he thinks about society is based upon principle, whereas the way Montesquieu thinks is he looks at institutions and the growth and development over time. So he's much more historically and culturally astute. That's why he writes, his great book is called The Spirit of the Laws, and it's to do with the fact that each people, each nation, has its own particular character, its spirit. And if you use a word like spirit, it's very obvious that that's something that doesn't really fit the more naturalistic understanding of things. So the spirit is this je ne sais quoi, this aspect that you know is there, you see its presence in the behaviour, but you can't actually reduce it to any one thing. And you certainly can't break it down into the Cartesian way of doing things, break it down into the simple parts and reassemble it. He had argued, and this is a really important pioneer of a certain kind of thinking about social and political formation, that things like climate, geography, social circumstance and history are intrinsic to that spirit. In this way, he also anticipates thinkers like Edmund Burke, I'll briefly talk about, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. At the same time, as he does this, so he's very aware, so he's interested in how, around the globe, you've got these different laws, different peoples, but he's also interested in doing a kind of typology of the forms of governance that exist. But he is also quite liberal. So here we see, if you like, a certain fracturing within liberal ways of thinking about the world. Okay, there's a fracturing. What do I mean by that? Is there's a constructivist and there's this much more organicist model. Montesquieu looks at England and he thinks, or Great Britain, that is a successful, economically strong, in fact the strongest economy in the world, strongest society of the world. Remember, he's writing in the middle of the 18th century, so even before the American Revolution. And it is one in which the principles of freedom, especially, drive the show to a large extent. But he did admire non-European societies. He didn't think that all could be or should be like Great Britain. But he thought there was something about Great Britain that was ultimately enviable, and in terms of the future, that would be the best way to go. But not everybody could do it. In this respect, he's much more like Aristotle compared to Plato, if we go back a bit. You recall when we compared Plato and Aristotle, Aristotle's method was comparativist. You also recall that although he accepted that it's meaningful to philosophically talk about a good society, and he actually drafts one himself, that doesn't mean that every kind of society can get there. So that you can desire to make certain changes which improve your lot, but it doesn't mean you can do a holus bolus change or simply go in and create a regime change the top and the rest will follow. And that's, Montesquieu is very like Aristotle in that way. I've mentioned Michel de Montaigne, and I want to talk about him very briefly. He's a very interesting character. And he, because like Montesquieu, they both use the exotopic, what I'm talking, that's a term from Mikhail Bakhtin, but it's a very good term and useful term. And that is, you can really see something if you look from outside it. So what Montaigne does, and Montesquieu I think picks up on this, and to some extent Rousseau is also very influenced by Montaigne, is that you can see what we're like by going and looking at peoples that are completely different to us. And in the case of Montaigne, he was fascinated by reports coming back from South America about the life of the Indians there. And he actually used that to draw attention to what he thought were the stultifications, limitations and toxicities of European society. And that is something, as I said, that Montesquieu is very attuned to, and Rousseau will develop this. In fact, in the case of Montesquieu, you can see he's very sympathetic to the Muslim societies, and he sees certain factors within Muslim societies which he thinks are much more enlightened than Christian society. Indeed, one of the things, and he wasn't alone in this, and this is very interesting. One of the things that people like Montesquieu and other enlightened figures saw in Islam, which appealed to them, was the fact that it was anti-Trinitarian. And of course, from a purely philosophical point of view, Trinitarianism just makes no sense at all. Trinitarianism is something that could only evolve out of, in a sense, a pre-enlightened kind of society, because it's dependent upon a contingency and a certain way of viewing the sacred. And in this respect, then, he sees that there is some kind of confluence between there is no God but God of Islam and the deists. Now, Montesquieu very much had a political agenda. He could see the problems in France, and he was really concerned, and he's a student also of what's happened in Great Britain and what happened with the revolution there, and he's really concerned to prevent despotism. In this way, I think he makes a very interesting contrast to Rousseau. And the reason he makes an interesting contrast to Rousseau is his primary focus is not upon the primacy of principle, which when you look at Rousseau is the primacy of principle. If the principle is right and you can act according to the principle, you can make the world better. It's rather the historical and institutional configurations that you have to discuss. So when he's looking at France, he's looking at its institutional development, the power relations, the social relationships that are occurring there. And he recognizes that political power must accompany social power. That's one of the great insights that he has. He does hold that liberty is important for developing human capacities and talents. He recognizes that virtue is necessary for a public to function well, but he's also aware of the dangers that will occur if one pushes equality too far. And the reason he emphasizes this, it comes back to him not being a constructivist. It comes back to not taking principle as a primary thing. That's because this is an abstraction. Equality and freedom in and of themselves, for Montesquieu, only really make any genuine social sense in terms of the operational powers and forces and institutional mediation that makes a society relatively equal and relatively free. So there's this, it's qualified, it's extremely qualified. Again, I would just say that one of the reasons I'm talking about this and wish to emphasize this is it's so commonplace for people to talk about political objectives or make political criticisms on the basis of freedom and equality being taken as absolute. So Montesquieu is wary of that kind of absolutism. And he says, this is a great quote, it says, "A nation may lose its liberties in a day and not miss them in a century." That is, we really don't see all the things that surround us as they're occurring, where our consciousness is very limited And it's what is taking place in our daily practices that is intrinsic to the kind of world that we're living in. And it's very easy to lose things we've gained. He saw England as the best system of government. He believed that England had, through its own historical evolution, had hit upon what he called the separation of powers, and he saw that as which in point of fact is not quite true, but there is a certain dispersal of powers, which would be a much more accurate way to put it. And he argued that the legislature, the executive, the judiciary must be in different hands. And this would be very important in the United States in the formation of the kind of republican constitution that you have in the United States. And Montesquieu, along with Locke, was a very important figure in the evolution of that model, or the development of that model. He emphasized that industrial society, even though it's really pre-industrial, but let's call it industrial, that the kind of society in which there is going to be industrious behavior, that's really what is meant here in this case, requires certain habits and sentiments being inculcated in the population. They have to be cultivated. They're not natural. They have to be developed. But it's not just through an education as such, but it's through the way they occur in basic practices. I mentioned last week that he had contrasted Italy with Great Britain, the cruelty of Great Britain under Henry VIII, but in the long run, he says, that is what enabled its wealth. Now, let me just pause upon there and make the point that modernizing is shocking. And it's shocking because if you don't modernize, you're screwed. If you do modernize, it can be, and you do it quickly, it's very cruel. So whatever you do, you're going to pay a great sacrificial price to achieve what you want. But Montesquieu certainly thought there is no way out of this, at least for societies that have reached a certain level and scale of social development. If certain aspects of the spirit of modernizing, I'll put it that way. He doesn't quite put it that way, but I'll put it that way. Have to be cultivated. So he also recognizes that France had reacted badly to the Reformation, and he thinks that it has failed to learn the lesson of the English Revolution. So what he is basically appealing to is two contrary forces. He's appealing to the authority that is already there and the social powerful groups that are seeking political authority. And he believed, and he was not wrong in this, that if the one did not give way, the other would seize power, but in seizing power it would try and annihilate all the aspects of the ancient ways, all those older spirits, and it would find itself unable to fulfill all the functions that those spirits previously preserved. He was also an advocate for tolerance, as that quotation suggests. Now, he's very much an institutionalist. Let's now look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in many ways, is, I think, maybe the most important, let's leave Marx to one side, but the most important figure of the modern radical imagination. Indeed, the kind of paradoxes and contradictions which are constitutive of Rousseau's own personage, as well as his thinking, are such that I think they're instantly recognizable to us today. Rousseau wants equality and he wants freedom. He wants progress, but he's caught up in nostalgia. He wants community, but he wants isolation. He wants modernity and he wants preservation. Rousseau was the kind of guy, in fact, not the kind of guy, Rousseau was a person who would write a book about the centrality of community in life, and then also write another book in which it's very clear that he can't stand other human beings, and all he wants is a solitary existence. And that book is called Reveries of a Solitary Walker. Personally, he went and visited David Hume, and Hume just thought he was complete crazy. He was he wrote a book called The Confessions. And in the Confession, Jean-Jacques presents himself as the new Adam, the new person. And the new person will be the example of how we ought to be. And of course, who else wrote a confession? Who we studied in this course. Who else wrote a book called The Confessions? Well, The Confessions. Augustine. But Rousseau, in writing this autobiography, which of course is one in which he's very self-forgiving, Rousseau is presenting himself as this contradictory person driven by sensibility, by feeling, by passion, but also by reason. And so Rousseau, in a sense, is the embodiment of the modern contradictory soul. And I think it is true that the modern soul, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel will use the term, the modern soul is a divided self. It's divided between what it is and what it wishes to be. It's divided in all sorts of ways because it compartmentalizes life according to the abstractions which now motivate it. And that's one of the things that comes out of the emphasis upon the human understanding, is that it gravitates at one point towards this, and now towards this, and now towards this, and it makes of these the basis of various principles. But how do they all become reconciled? Now, that's something that really concerns Hegel. But in the case of Rousseau, I think he's quite happy to just put it out there. And okay, let's go into some of this. First of all, Rousseau is the person that really creates, I think, one of the most important ideas of the radical imagination, and that is that it is the system that is defective. So if we can change the system, then we can fix the world, we can remedy the world. Another way of saying that is that it is the antithesis of the position which emphasizes human frailty or weakness, errancy, or to use a theological term, original sin. On the contrary, and here we can see a revival of an idea that Augustine fought against. On the contrary, Rousseau is saying, if we sin, it's because we come from a society in which sin is part and parcel of it. If we can fix that, then we'll fix this other thing. So we are the product of our social circumstance. And if we can change that circumstance, then we won't have to conform to the misshapen nature that we've been given. Because our natural, and here's the rub, our nature is essentially innocent. We're born innocent. And he then goes back into this social contract theory, And unlike Hobbes, he doesn't emphasize conflict. He thinks that that's completely wrong. That only happens when you've already got circumstances which lead to a breakdown and war. So in that sense, he's a bit like Locke. But he doesn't think we're acquisitive in the way that Locke did. In Rousseau's state of nature, we're basically just living in a state of a pre-social state where we avoid each other. We tend to simple aspects of survival. We're not brutal. We're not acquisitive. That's not in our nature. We're innocent. And what society makes of us is ultimately what we will become. That's why to fix a bad society is a fundamental requirement of living the way that we should, to fix the bad society. Here, again, it's incredible that Marx doesn't talk. I can't think of a place where Marx talks about Rousseau. And I did my PhD on Marx. I've done a lot of reading on Marx. And there might be somewhere. I know Lucio Coletti, an Italian Marxist, talks about Rousseau in relationship to Marx. But I can't recall where Marx ever really goes into that. And in part, that's because Rousseau is only interested in a very simple kind of society and wants to revive a much more simple kind of society. But the one thing they certainly have in common is the idea that inequality and corruption begin with property. Begins with property. And Rousseau says the first person that put a fence around some property and said, this is mine, the rest of the people surrounding him would have done the human race a great favour had they killed him and buried him in a ditch. Rousseau also came into prominence by writing an award-winning essay in which he argued that there's no real moral improvement in the development of the arts and the sciences. And I think that too is a very contemporary radical idea that shows how Rousseau is an exemplary figure of a certain way of viewing the world and how to participate in the world. So even if there's improvement in a technical sense, that doesn't make us morally better. So what Rousseau is also implying and suggesting, and this is why Voltaire really couldn't stand this aspect of Rousseau. Couldn't stand it. And his idea was that, well, actually the arts and sciences, they corrupt us. We get worse. We're getting worse. So as we think we're developing, we're building the very things that make us worse as human beings. Here too is another very important driver behind Rousseau. And if we look at the French Revolution and we look at a character like Robespierre and the importance of virtue for Robespierre, because Robespierre wanted to create a more virtuous society, that's utterly Rousseauian, because Rousseau is concerned with virtue and he sees that going to the theatre only clouds us with all sorts of wrong sentiments. Scientific developments only empowers us in the wrong way. It's our virtue that we need to develop. So society is corruptive. We're not inherently constrained by human nature. Indeed, we're born free, but everywhere we're in chains. That's the opening of a social contract. And it's one of the greatest lines of modern political philosophy that's ever been written. It's, or at least as a rhetorical line. It's a fantastic line. But there are many who would argue that, and I'm thinking now of Giordano Bruno, a great Renaissance philosopher who was actually burnt at the stake in around 1600. Bruno had argued that freedom is always enchainment. And that had also, in another kind of way, that had been Luther's position. So if you say we're born free and everywhere in chains, what you're suggesting is there's a way of living which is beyond bondage. And as I said, that can be contested, because if you do this act through your act of freedom, then you become bound to all the things that enable the furtherance of that act. So you're stepping outside, in the sense, you're stepping outside at a moral level the entire natural condition. And this is why Immanuel Kant will be Rousseau's greatest pupil, because he will take something that in Rousseau is pretty contradictory, and he will give it a metaphysical circumscription which defends this idea of our capacity for virtue is such in which human dignity will flourish, and that requires that we get beyond the natural condition. Okay, I'll leave it there. I just saw the time.